September 14th, 2009, 18 drones and 7 cruise missiles slam into Saudi Arabia's largest oil processing facility. In seconds, half of Saudi oil production goes offline, 5% of global supply vaporized. But here's what nobody understood that morning. Iran didn't miss. They didn't fail. They executed the most sophisticated geographical threat demonstration in modern history. Because those missiles weren't meant to destroy Saudi Arabia. They were meant to deliver a message, and that message was simple. Every single barrel of oil leaving the Persian Gulf, every tanker carrying 21 million barrels daily through the Strait of Hormuz, exists because Iran allows it to exist. This is a chokepoint strategy, and Americans should recognize it, because we invented it. In M41, we strangled Japan's oil supply so completely that they had no choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. We controlled their energy. We controlled their future. Now the geography has flipped. Iran sits on one side of a 21-mile-wide corridor that carries 40% of all seaborne oil, and they've just proven they can reach out and touch anyone, anytime. Welcome to America's Hormuz problem. That facility you're looking at is Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia's crown jewel, the largest oil export terminal on Earth. $400 billion of infrastructure concentrated in one location. Storage tanks stretching across the desert like silver coins waiting to be collected. Pipelines feeding 7 million barrels a day toward tankers that carry the lifeblood of the global economy. And every single piece of it sits within striking distance of Iranian territory. We're talking about a target that requires 0 precision missiles, 0 advanced fighter jets. A swarm of cheap drones launched from a fishing boat could cripple this facility in under an hour. The Iranians know this. The Saudis know this. The Americans definitely know this. This isn't a military installation protected by layers of defense systems and hardened bunkers. There's no hiding it, no moving it, no protecting every inch of exposed pipeline snaking across open terrain. What you're looking at is the most valuable hostage in geopolitical history. And the ransom note hasn't even been written yet, because Iran doesn't need to attack Ras Tanura. They just need everyone to remember they can. The question isn't whether Iran outsmarted Washington. It's how a nation under the most brutal sanction regime ever constructed learned to weaponize the very pressure designed to destroy it. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. America didn't just stumble into this trap. We built it, perfected it, and then forgot the most important lesson it taught us. 80 years ago, the United States deployed this identical strategy against another resource-rich nation sitting on critical geography. We froze their assets, strangled their oil imports, cut them off from the global financial system. The goal was submission. What we got instead was Pearl Harbor. Imperial Japan didn't surrender to economic pressure. They calculated that slow strangulation meant certain death anyway, so they chose war, a desperate, catastrophic gamble that killed millions. Now Iran sits in that same corner, same playbook, same impossible choice. But Tehran has been watching, learning, and they've discovered something Washington never anticipated. There's a third option between surrender and suicidal war, and it requires understanding one geographic choke point that controls 20% of the world's oil supply. The year is 1941. America hasn't fired a single shot in World War II, but in a cramped office in Washington, military strategists are already winning it. Their weapon? A map, not of battlefields, of bottlenecks. They've identified every choke point where the world's oil must flow. The Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and one narrow passage that keeps appearing in classified briefings, circled in red ink, the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, flanked entirely by one nation's coastline, and through it flows the lifeblood of modern warfare, petroleum. The admirals understood something that would define the next 80 years of American foreign policy. Control the choke points, and you control the oil. Control the oil, and you control who wins wars. But there was a problem. The country bordering that strait wasn't an ally. It wasn't an enemy either. It was something far more dangerous to American strategists. It was unpredictable. Persia, soon to be renamed Iran. And in 1941, the men studying that map made a decision that would echo into our present crisis. Japan's war machine was a monster that ran on borrowed blood. By 1941, the empire had conquered Manchuria, invaded China, and set its sights on Southeast Asia. But here's what the generals in Tokyo understood better than anyone. Their entire military operated on a ticking clock. 80% of Japan's oil came from a single source. The United States. Every battleship, every Zero fighter, every tank rolling through China, all of it depended on American crude flowing across the Pacific. So when Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in July 1941, he wasn't making a diplomatic statement. He was squeezing a windpipe. The total oil embargo that followed gave Japan a choice: abandon its imperial ambitions and withdraw from China, or watch its military grind to a halt within 18 months as reserves ran dry. Roosevelt never fired a shot, he never had to. He simply controlled the choke point. And this is the lesson that echoes through every decade since. The nation that controls the flow doesn't need the largest army. It doesn't need the most advanced weapons. It needs geography and the will to use it. Japan's admirals ran the numbers, and the math was devastating. At current consumption rates, the Imperial Navy had 18 months of oil reserves. Maybe less if they pushed into Southeast Asia. The army? Even worse. Every single day that passed, Japan grew weaker while America grew stronger. This wasn't economic pressure. This was slow-motion strangulation. And Roosevelt knew exactly what he was doing. The embargo offered Japan two paths, and only two paths. Path 1, surrender. Pull out of China, abandon Manchuria, accept American terms and watch a decade of conquest evaporate overnight. The military government would collapse. Generals would face execution for failure. Path 2, war. Strike south. Seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Take British Malaya. Secure the rubber, the tin, the resources needed to survive. But here's the trap within the trap. To reach those oil fields, the Japanese fleet would have to pass dangerously close to American bases in the Philippines. They couldn't secure their southern conquests without neutralizing the American Pacific Fleet first. Geography had drawn them a map with only one destination: Pearl Harbor. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Japan had 18 months of oil reserves, maybe less. Every day those American sanctions continued, their military grew weaker, their options narrower. They faced an impossible choice: surrender their empire without firing a shot, or gamble everything on a desperate strike. Their strategists studied the maps obsessively. If they could seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields fast enough, they could break rule from the choke point strangling them. But the American Pacific Fleet stood in the way, anchored at Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan made its move. Not from strength, but from desperation. The attack wasn't madness, it was mathematics. They calculated they had one chance to knock America back long enough to secure those oil fields and establish a defensive perimeter. The choke point strategy had worked exactly as designed. America never fired a single shot at a Japanese tanker, never blockaded a single port. They simply controlled the valve, and Japan came to them. This is the terrifying power of energy choke points. They don't just threaten nations, they force their hand completely. Every empire learns this truth eventually. You don't need to conquer territory. You don't need boots on the ground or flags planted in foreign soil. You need something far more elegant: choke points. The British understood it with Suez. The Americans perfected it with the global financial system. And now Iran has weaponized it with the Strait of Hormuz. Control the geography that resources must flow through, and you control the economy. Control the economy, and you control the nation. No invasion required, no declaration of war needed. This is the new calculus of power. 40% of the world's seaborne oil passes through a channel narrower than the English Channel, 21 miles wide at its tightest point. And Tehran sits on one side with missiles, drones, and fast attack boats ready to turn that passage into a graveyard of tankers. The lesson America taught the world about economic leverage? Iran learned it. They studied it. And they built their entire strategic doctrine around a simple principle: if you can threaten to stop the flow, you don't need a superpower's military. You just need patience and a map. For 80 years, America wrote the playbook on choke point warfare. Blockade Japan, strangle Germany, control the seas, control the outcome. Washington assumed this weapon belonged to superpowers, to blue water navies, to nations with aircraft carriers and global reach. They were wrong. Because sometime in the 1980s, Iranian military planners spread a map across a table in Tehran and saw what American strategists had missed. They didn't need a massive navy. They didn't need bases across the world. They already possessed the most valuable choke point on Earth. the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And through that tiny gap flows 21 million barrels of oil every single day, 1/5 of global supply, the economic oxygen of Europe, Asia, and America's closest allies. Iran didn't need to project power across oceans, they just needed to sit exactly where they already sat. With missiles pointed at a bottleneck the entire world depends on, the student had become the teacher, and America suddenly realized its own playbook could be used against everything it built. Every single day, 20% of the world's oil supply squeezes through a gap narrower than the English Channel. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its choking point. On one side the Arabian Peninsula, on the other Iran. And here's what makes this geography so devastating. There's no alternative. Every tanker carrying Saudi crude, Kuwaiti reserves, Emirati exports, Iraqi production, all of it must pass within striking distance of Iranian territory. We're talking about ships the length of aircraft carriers, moving at walking speed, through waters shallow enough that a single sunken vessel could block traffic for weeks. Iran didn't choose this position. Geology chose it for them. Millions of years of tectonic movement created the perfect maritime choke point, and Tehran inherited it. They've lined that northern coastline with anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, naval mines stockpiled by the thousands, submarines designed specifically for these shallow waters. The world's most advanced navies have wargamed this scenario repeatedly. The conclusion is always the same: you can eventually force the strait open, but eventually doesn't keep gas stations running or economies functioning. This is leverage that money cannot buy. The missiles that slammed into Ras Tanura weren't meant to destroy, they were meant to terrify. Iran's strike on Saudi Arabia's crown jewel wasn't a military operation. It was a calculated demonstration, a proof of concept delivered in fire and smoke. The message was brutally simple: we can reach your most valuable infrastructure whenever we choose. But here's what most analysts missed. The real target wasn't the Saudi royal family. It wasn't even the refinery itself. The real targets were sitting in boardrooms in London, Tokyo, and New York. Insurance underwriters who now have to recalculate every tanker policy transiting the Gulf. Shipping executives who must explain to shareholders why their vessels face unprecedented risk. Oil traders watching futures contracts swing wildly on every headline from Tehran. Iran didn't need to shut down Ras Tanura. They just needed to prove they could. Because the moment that proof exists, the entire economic calculus changes. Premiums spike, shipping costs explode, and $400 billion worth of crude suddenly carries a risk premium that reshapes global energy markets. One strike, 1,000 consequences, and Iran didn't even have to win. Saudi Arabia sits on $400 billion of oil infrastructure. Refineries stretching across the desert, pipelines snaking toward the coast, processing facilities that took decades to build. But here's what the balance sheets don't tell you. Every dollar of that investment depends on one thing: getting oil onto tankers and out to sea. Without exports, a refinery is just expensive metal baking in the sun. Iran understands this perfectly. They don't need to destroy Saudi infrastructure. They don't need to invade. They just need to make the world believe they could close the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow. And suddenly, that $400 billion asset transforms into a $400 billion hostage. The Saudis must maintain facilities that could become worthless overnight. They must pay for security they can never fully guarantee. They must watch their economic lifeline pass within missile range of their greatest rival. Every single day. This is the genius of geographic leverage. Iran spends almost nothing to threaten what Saudi Arabia spent everything to build. The infrastructure isn't power anymore. It's vulnerability, priced in hundreds of billions. And here's where Iran's geographic weapon becomes a perfect trap. If America retaliates militarily, Iran doesn't need to win the war. They just need to close the Strait of Hormuz. 20 miles of water, that's all it takes. The moment those shipping lanes shut down, 21 million barrels of oil stop flowing. Every single day. Oil prices don't just rise, they triple, overnight. Your gas station hits $10 a gallon by Tuesday. Within 2 weeks, supply chains collapse. Within a month, factories close. Within 6 weeks, you're looking at a global recession that makes 2008 look like a minor correction. And here's the brutal math Washington has to calculate. Any military strike against Iran triggers this response. America would be spending billions to attack a country only to crash its own economy in the process. Iran knows this. They've known it for 40 years. Every American president since Carter has run these war games. Every single simulation ends the same way. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just geography. It's a loaded gun pointed at the global economy, and Iran's finger never leaves the trigger. The Fifth Fleet sits in Bahrain, 30 miles from Iranian shores. Carrier strike groups rotate through these waters carrying enough firepower to level cities. Air bases dot the Arabian Peninsula, Al Udeid, Al Dhafra, Prince Sultan, thousands of aircraft ready to scramble at a moment's notice. All of it exists for one reason, to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. And here's the paradox that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. The moment any of those weapons fire against Iran, the strait closes anyway. Every missile launched, every sortie flown, every ship that Geopolitical engages, it triggers the exact outcome the entire military presence was built to prevent. Iran doesn't need to win a war. They just need to start one. Those carriers become targets, not deterrents. Those air bases become magnets for ballistic missiles. The massive military infrastructure America spent decades building transforms from a shield into a liability. This is the escalation trap. The gun pointed at the lock is also pointed at your own head. Strength becomes weakness. Deterrence becomes provocation. And Iran knows it. Iran doesn't need to win a war. It doesn't even need to fight one. This is the genius of asymmetric strategy. Tehran has calculated something that Western planners consistently underestimate: the cost of confrontation versus the cost of accommodation. Every drone strike on a Saudi oil facility, every missile test broadcast on state television, every military exercise in the Strait. These aren't random provocations, they are price signals. Each incident forces a calculation in Washington, in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi. Is this worth a regional war? Is this worth $5 a gallon gasoline? Is this worth explaining to voters why their sons and daughters are deployed to another Middle Eastern conflict? The answer keeps coming back the same: not quite. And Iran knows this. They've watched America's appetite for intervention collapse after 2 decades of grinding wars. They've watched European economies buckle under energy shocks. They've learnt that you don't defeat a superpower by matching its strength. You exhaust its patience. So the provocations continue, calibrated, deniable, just below the threshold that demands response, death by 1,000 calculations. Saudi Arabia built the most expensive military in the Middle East. They bought American jets, British tanks, German systems. They spent $400 billion in a single decade, and none of it matters. Because every barrel of oil that funds their kingdom, every tanker that keeps their economy breathing, must pass through 21 miles of water that Iran can close in hours. The Saudis are learning what Japan understood in Number 1. When your lifeline runs through someone else's territory, you don't have independence. You have an arrangement. You have tolerance. You have permission that exists only as long as the gatekeeper allows it. This is why Riyadh's foreign policy shifted so dramatically, why they suddenly pursued dialogue with Tehran after years of hostility. Why Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who once called Iran's leader the Hitler of the Middle East, now sends diplomats to negotiate. It wasn't a change of heart, it was mathematics. 400 billion in weapons cannot reopen a closed strait, cannot guarantee safe passage, cannot force cooperation. The Saudis finally understood they were never the customer. They were always the dependent. The math is elegant in its brutality. Iran spent perhaps $2 billion arming and training Houthi forces over a decade. Saudi Arabia spent $400 billion building infrastructure that now lives under permanent threat. That's a 200-to-1 return on investment. And here's what keeps defense ministers awake at night. Iran doesn't need to win. It doesn't need to conquer. It doesn't even need to fire another missile. The threat alone reshapes every calculation. Want to sanction Tehran? Remember Ras Tanura. Planning strikes on nuclear facilities? Consider what happens to Sheba the next morning. Thinking about regime change? Picture global oil at $300 a barrel. Iran has transformed geography itself into a weapon. The Houthis aren't terrorists in this framework. They're a strategic asset with infinite patience and zero accountability. Every diplomatic meeting now carries an invisible weight. Every negotiation happens in the shadow of what could happen to the global economy if talks collapse. $400 billion in Saudi steel and concrete has become Iran's hostage. And the ransom? It's paid continuously, in silence through policies never enacted and wars never fought. Every nation with a coastline watched this unfold. Every military strategist took notes. Because Iran just rewrote the rules of modern power. You don't need aircraft carriers. You don't need stealth bombers or trillion-dollar defense budgets. You need the right piece of geography and the willingness to threaten it. China understood immediately. The South China Sea isn't about fishing rights. It's about controlling the lanes where 40% of global trade passes daily. Russia took notes too. Energy pipelines crossing Eastern Europe aren't just infrastructure. They're leverage, frozen into steel. The Strait of Hormuz proved something uncomfortable. Superpowers don't dictate terms when their economies hang by a geographic thread. They negotiate. They calculate. They compromise. This is the new mathematics of global power. One narrow waterway neutralized decades of American military supremacy, not through confrontation but through position. The world's most advanced navy didn't lose a battle. It simply discovered that some battles cannot be won through firepower alone. Geography doesn't care about your weapons, it only cares about who controls the bottleneck. America invented this game. For 80 years, Washington perfected economic warfare through chokepoint control, the dollar as a weapon, swift as a stranglehold, sanctions designed to strangle nations without firing a single shot. Iran was the test case. 45 years of economic isolation, frozen assets, blocked transactions, a nation brought to its knees through geography and financial architecture. But here's what Washington never considered. The student was taking notes. Every sanction taught Iran the value of choke points. Every blocked transaction revealed the pressure points. Every economic squeeze demonstrated exactly how geography becomes leverage. Now the tables have turned. And the cruelest irony? America built the very system that makes Iran's weapon devastating. Washington spent decades convincing the world to depend on Middle Eastern oil. American companies built the tanker fleets. American policy shaped the trade routes. American consumption created the demand. The global economy's addiction to oil flowing through that narrow strait? That's not Iran's creation. That's America's legacy, weaponized against its architect. The empire taught the colony how to fight back. The year was 1941. America choked Japan's oil supply, betting Tokyo would back down. Instead, they got Pearl Harbor. Geography doesn't negotiate. Now flip the board. Iran sits on that same pressure point, watching America's carriers patrol waters where a single missile cost less than a single hour of fleet operations. They've studied our playbook. They know the math. 20% of the world's oil, 40% of seaborne crude. One narrow passage where depth charges and tanker hulls share the same shallow waters. The Strait of Hormuz isn't closing tomorrow. That's not the threat. The threat is the possibility. The constant calculated possibility that keeps insurance premiums climbing, keeps naval budgets bleeding, keeps American foreign policy anchored to a waterway 7,000 miles from home. Iran didn't build a military to defeat us. They built a toll booth. So the question was never if they could close the strait. It's what we'll sacrifice to keep it open. How many carriers? How many billions? How many compromises? And here's what history teaches us. The one who sets the price usually collects it.